مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. أتذكر عندما كنت طفلا أنه من الممكن التكهن بما سيفعله الحزب الجمهوري. كان الديمقراطيون يخوضون انتخابات تمهيدية متقلبة ومليئة بالمنافسة. بالنسبة إلى الجمهوريين كان الأمر أشبه بالخلافة الملكية، حيث كان الترشح دائما تقريبا من نصيب المسؤول الأكبر في الحزب الذي يريد أن يترشح للانتخابات. الآن تغير كل شيء، فالحزب الديمقراطي متمسك بأكبر مسؤوليه سنا، الرئيس الأكبر سنا في تاريخ أمريكا، بينما يواجه الجمهوريون واحدة من أكثر المعارك الانتخابية التمهيدية إثارة للجدل في التاريخ. اعتبارا من اليوم هناك 11 مرشحا والقائمة في تزايد مستمر. سيخوض الجمهوريون مئات الانتخابات الأخرى في عام 2024، خاصة انتخابات الحفاظ على سيطرتهم الهزيلة للغاية على مجلس النواب واستعادتهم الأغلبية في مجلس الشيوخ. ما هو تأثير السباق الرئاسي على هذه الانتخابات؟ هل جهود استعادة البيت الأبيض ستساعد الحزب أو تدور به خلال خوضه حملاته الانتخابية التشريدية؟ لمناقشة استراتيجية الجمهوريين السياسية الخاصة بكل انتخابات عام 2024 يسعدني أن أرحب بفريق من المراقبين السياسيين البارزين جيسيكا تايلور وأليكس بولتون وجيمس أنتل. Welcome back to داخل Washington. We're about 16 months away from our 2024 elections. Lots of planning, lots of action, not too many headlines yet, except about the exploding number of Republican candidates all trying to see if they can take advantage of what appears to be political weakness on the part of Donald Trump. We're going to take a look in today's episode at Republican strategy across the board, presidential, Senate, House, elections coming up. Delighted to welcome Jessica Taylor and Jim Antle. All right, as I said, at least 11 candidates, more seem to be emerging every week. If you're Donald Trump's campaign manager, Jessica, how are you feeling right now?
I think you're feeling pretty good because despite 2 indictments as of now, and another one probably coming from Georgia, what doesn't kill him makes him stronger with Republican primary electorates. You can look at the polling trajectory, and when he was first indicted in New York, and now we're seeing this now, that his numbers continue to rise, that he has a steady lead in Iowa, an even larger lead in New Hampshire, a massive lead nationally. And the biggest threat was always if there was one consensus candidate against him. That has not happened. And the man who was believed to be the most consensus-ish candidate, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, has really not gotten off to an impressive start. We see his numbers fading in places. And so I think you're feeling pretty good because you're still the de facto leader of the party. You have at least a third of the base with you, probably more. And really that there is no one most viable alternative. And until that happens, then you're in sort of the catbird seat still.
Jim, how did Trump get to be so lucky that instead of having one consensus alternative, he has a dozen people nipping at his heels?
Well, but the nipping at the heels part is pretty important. So you have what is getting to be a large field, but very few of these candidates are registering anything that could be considered significant support. So it may be the case that if you didn't have a Mike Pence and a Nikki Haley and a Tim Scott and in New Hampshire, a Chris Christie getting what they're getting, and all of those votes went to Ron DeSantis, the race would look a little bit more competitive, and you'd have a situation where maybe DeSantis could consolidate at least some of the college-educated Republican voters. But what we have right now looks a little bit more like the 2016 Democratic field than it does the 2016 Republican field, in that you have a lot of Martin O'Malley's, maybe a lot of Jim Webb's and Lincoln Chafee's, but Trump right now is Hillary and Ron DeSantis is Bernie. And until that changes, I mean, I think you have a situation where a lot of people are getting in because they assume logically at some point Trump's legal situation could make his candidacy untenable, and Ron DeSantis doesn't seem to be capitalizing on that very effectively. But none of these candidates, the logic of this on paper may be true, but in practice, many of these candidates don't really have a lot of support.
Trump is Hillary. That's a great line. I'm sure
I don't think he'd like that line, but yes.
So, Jessica, why would smart, ambitious people like the mayor of Miami, Francis Suarez, or former Congressman Texas Will Hurd, why would they run for president when they have virtually no chance of emerging from this field?
It increases your name ID. It can parlay into a better job. It could parlay into a cabinet position down the line, though I'm not sure someone like Will Hurd, if Trump wins, that he would want to be in a Trump cabinet necessarily, is more of a Trump critic. But it can also expose your weaknesses, as we saw this week with the Miami mayor there, not knowing key foreign policy and foreign policy issues and things. So it can be risky. It's your entrance onto a national stage. But I mean, as Jim said, there's just, it is so split between this that, I mean, I think Mike Pence, I don't see a path for him. I think a Politico article sort of listed the other contenders below DeSantis and Trump as Pence, Haley, and Scott, and I think that was kind of being a little generous to Mike Pence. I think if I could see another person catching fire, I could see it be Tim Scott, the African-American senator from South Carolina. But is he sort of really running maybe for the number 2 job, which I think that he would readily accept? And then is there sort of a desire for another candidate if this DeSantis bubble, as we're seeing it, do fade? Is that Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin or somebody? But you have sort of just that sort of never Trump wing of the party. I mean, Chris Christie is the loudest that has gotten in, but it is just not overwhelming or anything. That is not the direction that the primary electorate wants to take, versus, even though that might be the strongest path in a general election, certainly.
The Republican Party has pretty tight rules that have just been put into place about who can appear on a debate stage when they have official debates. Jim, how many do you think we'll eventually see make it pass the rules and appear on a national debate stage?
Well, I think, they're going to want to have at least 6 or 7 candidates, I'd suppose, qualify if they can make that work, particularly if former President Donald Trump doesn't show up to the debates. They're going to want the debates to be an event where Trump is going to have to reconsider his non-participation. But if Trump boycotts the debates, the question then becomes, could that be an opportunity for someone like Ron DeSantis to then dominate those proceedings and really sort of reinvigorate his candidacy? Or, as I think Trump probably supposes, does this mean that everybody else on this stage is going to beat up on Ron DeSantis as the de facto frontrunner who's there? Trump's going to seem above the fray, and it's all going to look like those undercard Republican debates that they tried in 2016 for some of the lower polling but high reputation candidates. So the very viability and vitality of these debates, I think, is very much in question based on whether the front runner sees fit to participate in them.
And Jessica, why would Donald Trump miss an opportunity to be on national television and burnish his image again?
Because he feels like they need him more than he needs them, and he can hold a competing event like he did, I think it was right before Iowa in a primary. And there's an NBC story out this morning, in fact, that kind of talks about that he might sort of hold his own counter programming, essentially forcing networks to do it. He feels like Fox News has not been friendly enough to him. They've sort of boosted DeSantis a little too much. He went off sort of on Truth Social about that this morning. So it's really him trying to sort of remind them that if they want people to turn in, they need him there. So I think he's trying to just exert as many concessions as he can.
And welcome to Alex Bolton joining our show. Alex, before we switch over to talking about all the hundreds of other elections that happen next November, is there some Republican out there, perhaps a white knight, perhaps Cinderella, that I forget whatever fairy tale character you want to use, that the party is still waiting to hear from, that might join the race, that shake things up?
Yeah, I think that guy would be Glenn Youngkin, the governor of Virginia. I think he ruled himself out early on, but then there were reports that he was reconsidering. I think he is an attractive candidate because he was kind of the first Republican to seize on the parental rights issue, and he won in a Democratic-leaning state, Virginia, against a seasoned Democrat, Terry McAuliffe. He projects the sunny optimism that Republicans think they're missing right now. They don't think that Governor DeSantis nor President Trump really have that Reagan-esque optimism, that shining city on a hill type vision that worked well for the Republican Party in the past. And they feel that Glenn Youngkin is the guy who could do it. Tim Scott, the senator from South Carolina, he's tried to adopt that Reagan-esque sunny positivism, but he hasn't really connected with voters. He, I think in many ways, doesn't have the same, he doesn't quite, I think, I'm not sure he connects as well as Youngkin does. I think Youngkin is seen as a more talented politician than Scott. While Scott is highly revered in the Senate Republican Conference, he is very cautious, and he has floundered a bit at times on the campaign trail, notably when asked about whether he'd support a national abortion ban. He kind of whiffed on that question a couple times before he settled on his answer.
All right, so maybe one more announcement to come. The current governor of Virginia, Glenn Youngkin. All right, after the break, we're going to turn to Congress to look at the big elections for the Senate and the House and how the Republican Party is positioning itself to try to keep control or get control of those critical parts of our national legislature. In just a moment. Again, my guests today include Jessica Taylor. Jessica is the Senate and Governor's editor for the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter, and the senior author of the 2022 edition of the Almanac of American Politics. Previously, she was a political reporter for National Public Radio and NBC News. Also joining us is W. James Antle III. Jim is the politics editor of the Washington Examiner, one of the leading voices of conservative news and opinion in our nation's capital. He was previously managing editor of the Daily Caller and senior writer for the American Conservative. He is the author of the book, Devouring Freedom: Can Big Government Ever Be Stopped? And also with us today is Alexander Bolton. Alex is senior staff writer at The Hill, a newspaper offering in-depth reporting on the politics and policy in our national legislature, where he covers Congress and the broader American political scene. All right, of course, the presidential election is not the only election we are having next November. Republicans have to defend a very narrow majority in the House of Representatives, and with only 10 of 33 seats to protect in the Senate, they hope to win back control of that upper chamber of Congress. How does the presidential race affect these races? With no senior national Republican leader in total control of the party, who is responsible for keeping an eye on the legislative side of these elections? So let's start with you, Jim. how does the presidential race affect what Republicans want to do on Capitol Hill?
Well, certainly, number one, it could have an influence on who controls the House, because depending on who the Republican nominee is, that could make it more or less difficult for people in swing districts, Republicans in districts that were carried by President Joe Biden in 2020, could make it more or less difficult for them to defend their seats. Certainly, that's a big starting point for Republicans when it comes to trying to preserve their House majority, potentially expand it. In the Senate, I don't think it affects very much, other than, I think the map remains what it is, other than, in the same vein, in some of these close Senate races, how the top of the ticket is performing could have an influence on whether some of these Republican candidates can get across the finish line. But when you're having states like West Virginia and Montana, I don't think it matters very much whether you have former President Donald Trump, Governor Ron DeSantis, or somebody else at the top of the ticket. I think running in these red at the presidential level states at the same time a presidential election is going on is going to be very difficult for a Joe Manchin, should he run again, or a John Tester, or a Sherrod Brown. It's going to be, so in the Senate, I think it's going to be more of a question of whether Senate Republican leadership and Trump can get on the same page in the primaries as they're trying to field the strongest possible candidates.
So Jessica, let's focus on the Senate for a minute. Democrats have a much bigger challenge in 2024 because so many of the contested seats are currently democratically held. Huge opportunity for Republicans. Are they poised to take advantage of it? Is there a strategy here to win back the Senate?
Well, the question is, can they learn from the mistakes of 2022, which is where we saw that candidates matter? I agree with Jim that I don't know that the top of the ticket will matter in places necessarily like Montana and West Virginia, but the candidates that Republicans nominate will matter. And that's why you see the National Republican Senatorial Committee. So you asked if there is another leader. There are heads of the House campaign arm, who is Richard Hudson from North Carolina. Steve Daines, senator from Montana, is leading the National Republican Senatorial Committee, and he is taking more of an outward approach, a proactive approach to recruiting candidates. They, in fact, this week they just landed a top tier recruit that they believe against John Tester in Montana, who has sort of foiled them now for 3 election cycles in a row, despite it being a Republican state that Trump won by 16 points. They've gotten behind a Purple Heart former Navy SEAL who was wounded in Afghanistan, Tim Sheehy. In West Virginia, they've gotten the former, not the current governor, who's term limited, Jim Justice, to run. But there are also sort of more conservative insurgent candidates that are like either already are challenging or are likely to challenge. And these are people that, especially in Montana, that a candidate that ran against him in 2018 and lost, that Republicans would very much worry that that would put a seat in danger. So the question is, can they get these candidates through the primaries? You're right, it is a complete gift of a Senate map because Democrats are defending 23 seats to just 11 for Republicans. And in our Senate ratings at the Cook Political Report, we only rate 8 races currently as competitive. That means toss up or lean either Republican or Democrat, and they're all Democratic held seats. So Democrats are playing entirely on defense. And really it is incumbent upon Republicans, if they want to defeat these Democratic incumbents, to get good candidates, to recruit them first of all, and then make sure they get through the primary. Now, last cycle, the NRSC took a very hands-off approach and sort of let these primaries play out, and you ended up with weaker nominees in places like Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania that Republicans lost these states. And in fact, Democrats ended up defying history and even gaining a seat. So right now, I mean, Republicans only need 1 seat to win back the majority if they also win back the presidency, or 2 if they do not. And the fact that you have 3 seats up that President Trump won handily in Ohio, West Virginia, and Montana, and then another host of battleground states that also are going to could have competitive races. I think Democrats are favored in places like Nevada. Arizona is kind of a unique scenario, but Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, perhaps. The opportunities are there, but even Mitch McConnell has been very cautious about this, realizing that in 2022, the lesson that it taught us is that candidates still matter.
Thank you very much, Jessica Taylor, Alex Bolton, Jim Antle, for offering us your perspective on how Republicans are already approaching the 2024 presidential and congressional elections. We just passed an important anniversary. It's 1 year since the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, reversed 50 years of precedent and took away the constitutional right of privacy that gave women in America the power and authority to choose to have an abortion if they so wished. That decision instead threw regulation of abortion back to the individual states. With the emergence since then of a great wall within our country, of states where abortion is banned or nearly banned after just a few weeks of pregnancy, often before women even know that they are pregnant, and states where abortion is regulated and permitted. To some people, this seems like a reasonable outcome. After all, we're a big country, and we should be able to accommodate some states with extreme restrictions on abortion and other states where the procedure is more freely available. The problem, of course, is that it is a huge obstacle to women, especially poor women, who are often, though not solely, women of color, an obstacle for them to pay the travel, hotel, and other costs to go from, say, Alabama or Texas or Florida to New York or Massachusetts or California to find a facility to have an abortion. And it's worse than that. The closure of dozens and dozens of health centers that provided women's reproductive health procedures, including abortions, means the loss of access to health care for millions of women in the states with tough abortion restrictions. Since Dobbs reversed Roe versus Wade, the 50-year-old decision that legalized abortion, there have been some political surprises. Kansas, for example, is a conservative state, but when voters were given the choice of approving or opposing an amendment to the state constitution that would have banned abortion, they voted by a huge margin to reject it. In battleground states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, the Dobbs decision became a battle cry, and it helped Democrats expand their Senate majority in 2022. In 2024, abortion is sure to be central to Joe Biden's re-election campaign, as he targets millions of centrist, even conservative, suburban moms who may want lower taxes and more control over their local schools, but who don't like the idea that a right that they grew up with, a right their mothers fought to achieve, was taken away by a Supreme Court that is increasingly viewed as being out of touch with mainstream America. Public opinion polls generally show that Americans want abortion to be safe, legal, and limited. That is, most people want there to be a reasonable time frame within which women can choose to have an abortion if they so wish. Finding that reasonable position is difficult, but it's what leaders do, negotiate the difficult. Instead, a sad system is emerging in our country in which women have access to abortion depending solely on the states in which they live. I didn't like the Dobbs decision when it came down, and I like it even less today. Until we have a court that changes its view, these will be battles fought in states across the country, and issues that dominate our national elections, including the presidential vote in 2024. 1 year since Dobbs, it is clear this issue is here to stay. Bahava nasalu nehayat hadihilhalka min barnamij dakhil Washington. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول العلاقة بين السباق الانتخابي للفوز بالبيت الأبيض والحملة الانتخابية للسيطرة على الكونغرس، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج InsideWashington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. أراكم الأسبوع المقبل وحتى ذلك حين شكرا وإلى اللقاء.